Yo, what is up, guys? I am so excited to bring you guys this video. This is going to be a guide to Hillbilly on Dead by Daylight, which is by far my favorite killer. There is so much to this killer. He has so much depth. There's so many things that you can do with him. We're going to be covering everything there is to say about Billy, this guide. We're going to be talking about how to play as him, all the different tips and tricks of things you can do, as well as all the survivor counterplay to him as well. So if you're struggling to play against Hillbilly, this video will also help you. I'd highly suggest you guys watch through the whole thing, regardless of whether you're a killer or survivor. I think there will be a ton to learn, and I am super excited to start, so let's get into it. Okay, so the way this video is going to be is in the beginning, I'm going to be explaining basically the very basics of Hillbilly, like what he does, his basic, stats, his move speed, the numbers for his ability and all that stuff, and I'll explain exactly what his ability is and some of the details about it. And then as the video goes on, I'm going to get more and more advanced, and towards the end, I'll probably be getting into some of the most advanced Billy stuff that you can do. So to start out, let's just go ahead and look here at this page, which shows his stats. This is an in-game page, by the way. You don't have to do anything special. You can just hover over him and hit F1, and you can see this. As you can see here, he is a 4.6 meters per second killer. That's his move speed. So he moves 4.6 meters per second. That is the standard for pretty much all killers. The only ones that move slower are the ones that are slower, which is like Huntress, Hag, Nurse, like there's some that are slower, but there's none that are faster. So it's the standard speed for any killer that is pretty fast. His terror radius is 32 meters, which is also pretty standard. Some people have less, but most people have 32 meters. And he's also a tall killer, which is sort of important when it comes to mind games. Shorter killers can mind game a little bit better in some areas, but it doesn't really matter that much. Okay, now let's get on to his actual ability, which is his chainsaw sprint. Now, his chainsaw sprint is basically his bread and butter. It's what makes him so fun and makes him so effective and what gives you such advanced strategies to do with him, which obviously that's going to be how it is for every killer, but this ability in particular has a lot of different utility and a lot of stuff to it, okay? So let's get started. The way it works is you have to hold M2, and then it takes a charge time before it actually kicks in, which is 2.5 seconds by default. We're going to be using nothing but default numbers. There's add-ons that can change this, but for now, we're going to go with just default numbers. So 2.5 second charge time. After the charge time is filled up and you activate the ability, you sprint at double your base speed. So your base speed is 4.6 meters per second, so that means you go 9.2 meters per second while you're chainsaw sprinting. So you run at a full speed, and any survivor that you connect with, you will stop, chainsaw them, and one-shot down them. The chainsaw will also break any pallets that are thrown that you come into contact with. While you're revving your chainsaw, your move speed actually gets reduced from 4.6 to 3.68. So you get about a full meter per second reduction while you're holding your chainsaw. So the survivors actually move at 4.0 meters per second, so they have a slight speed boost on you while you're holding out your chainsaw. The way the charge works is interesting too, because if you let go of M2, it doesn't completely drain the bar, it actually lowers it slowly. So if you know what you're doing, you can kind of just tap M2 and you can actually hold your chainsaw charge at anywhere you want on the bar, and you can just maintain it there. This is really important, and we're going to come back to this a little bit later. After chainsawing a survivor, or hitting a wall, or even just letting off your chainsaw in the open, you'll suffer a cooldown which lasts 3 seconds. During this cooldown, you'll move at a slightly reduced movement speed, and you won't be able to do any actions like swinging or starting another chainsaw or anything of the sort. Now, when you're actually in your chainsaw, your ability to turn left and right is pretty interesting. When you first start chainsawing, for like a first second, your sensitivity is really, really high. Like, you can turn very far, like more than 90 degrees. And this can mess with a lot of new Hillbilly players because they don't know how to control it. So you might end up veering off into walls or just turning way too much off the very beginning. But after that initial 1 second of high sensitivity, it kind of stabilizes, and then you can only turn left and right very slightly. And it makes it a lot easier to control, especially if you're newer to Hillbilly. The initial turn sensitivity is actually really interesting because it can be used in your favor as killer if you know what you're doing. But we'll get more into that later whenever we get to more advanced tactics. I also just want to throw in here real quick that the initial turn sense, the initial 1 second of high sensitivity, is actually affected by your controller sensitivity as killer. So if this is something that you're struggling with, if you're often running into walls, you can go into your settings and go to your killer controller sensitivity and set it to lower, and you won't turn as much off the initial sensitivity. Regardless of whether you're using a controller or a mouse and keyboard, it affects the initial turn sense. I'm not sure why, but I would highly suggest keeping it high and then watching the rest of the video, because there is a way to make this work in your favor. But if you are still learning and you want to turn it down, that's how you turn it down. Another really important thing to learn and get good at is knowing how much of an angle you can chainsaw around walls and objects without actually bumping them. If you go to a wall at a slight angle with the chainsaw, you can kind of slide along it and you won't actually collide with the wall and suffer a cooldown. But if the angle that you're facing goes towards the wall a little bit too much, then you'll bump into it and it'll stop your chainsaw, and then you'll also suffer for the 3-second cooldown. So it's a really good thing to learn. This is a pretty important thing to get good at because one of Billy's main strengths that he has over every other killer is the massive amount of mobility that his chainsaw gives him. So the ability to chainsaw through the map and get from one side to the other very quickly without bumping off objects over and over again and getting from one point to another is one of his major strengths. And learning to do that and traverse the map is one of the most important things to learn as Billy. Alright, now that we actually covered everything about the ability and how it works, now let's get into some actual tips. Now, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be giving tips on how to play as Hillbilly, but I'm also going to be giving tips on how to play against him as well. So we're going to be covering a bit of both sides. We're going to be covering him and his counterplay, and then also how to avoid his counterplay. So first off, I think the biggest, most important thing as Hillbilly when you're playing him is knowing when to go for a chainsaw and knowing when to just give up and use your regular M1 attack. For instance, if the survivor is close to a pallet or a window and you're close enough to get a hit, you might want to go for the regular M1 attack because trying to charge the chainsaw might screw you over if you don't have enough time to actually get the charge off, and he might get the pallet or window and then you won't get a hit at all. So you got to know when to take the safe M1 damage and when to go for the actual one-shot down. This is obviously something you can get better at with experience, because if you're newer to the game, you might not know how much distance is needed for you to land the chainsaw and how much distance is needed that you should go for the M1. But I would advise that if you're a newer player to Billy and you're trying to learn, to just go for chainsaws a lot more than not. Even if you mess them up, just use it as a learning experience, because if you're the kind of Hillbilly that only M1s, you're never going to really improve. So I would definitely be okay with failing and just practice as much as you can, because this is a really, really important step to learning Billy. Another really important thing to know as Hillbilly is that if the survivor is even at all aware of their surroundings, they'll be looking out for you, and landing chainsaws from pretty far away is rather difficult because your turning is not that good. So because of this, most Hillbilly players don't go for chainsaws unless they're very, very close to the survivor, pretty much right up against their back. This is often referred to as back revving, and you'll probably hear this quite a bit. Being this close to the survivor is good for you as Billy because it means that they have no time to actually juke. The second that you fill your charge of your chainsaw, as long as you're looking in their direction, it will instantly connect and they won't have any time to get away from it. If you're playing against better survivor players, it actually gets pretty hard to land your chainsaw sometimes because they can do a pretty good job of just spinning and trying to juke it. If you seem to be having issues with this, what you can do is you can 99% your chainsaw. And what I mean by this is you hold your charge at around 90 to 99%, and then wait for them to juke, and then wait for them to be done juking, and wait until you're ready to pull the trigger on the chainsaw. This makes it exponentially easier to land your chainsaws, and it's such a good habit to get into. If you're rushing your chainsaws against good survivors that are actively dodging, you're going to miss a lot of the time. And a lot of the time, the difference between getting a one-shot down on a survivor or missing and allowing them to loop you can sometimes be the difference between winning a game and losing a game. Okay, so as far as a survivor goes, if you're playing against a Hillbilly, generally what you want to do is you want to make sure that you stay near pallets and windows. Gigantic dead zones where there's no pallets and windows are huge dangers against Billy because he has the ability to one-shot down. The thing about it is, as long as you're near a window or a pallet, he can't actually get his chainsaw one-shot down. So it's really important to stay near objects and to know where you're going. If you do a good enough job of staying near pallets and windows, you can make the Hillbilly pretty much just an M1 killer, as long as he's not a very, very, very good Hillbilly. Keep in mind, this isn't always a 100% guarantee, and we're going to cover a lot of this later with the Hillbilly. There is a lot of things you can do even at pallets and windows to get chainsaws if you're good enough with Hillbilly. But if you're someone that's newer to the game and you're just trying to get the very basics down of how to play against Billies, a very basic low-level Billy won't know how to do these advanced techniques, and they'll play a lot more straightforward, so it won't really be a problem. I know this comes a lot more with knowing maps as opposed to actual decision making against the Hillbillies, so it's going to be kind of harder for a new player. I would say do your best to learn the maps if you can. It's definitely a good advantage to have in this game. But if you can manage to do this, if you can manage to stay on tiles that have windows and pallets, it'll help you a lot because it'll prevent him from going for chainsaws, because if he does, he'll get punished by not being allowed to get them. And then if you do slip up and make a mistake where he's able to get a hit, he'll likely have to get an M1 hit as opposed to a chainsaw hit, which will help you a lot with staying alive. Make sure that you also always keep an eye on the Billy if you can, especially while he's chainsawing, because if you're just out in the middle of the open or you're just running along and he chainsaws near you, it's really easy to juke it as long as you know that he's coming. He doesn't really have a lot of turn control in his chainsaw, so all you gotta really do is run to one of the sides. But if you're not really looking, sometimes you'll just eat a chainsaw from far away that's really unnecessary. If the Billy is near, though, and you're in danger of being chainsawed, a good thing that you can do is kind of run in a straight line, and then right before the chainsaw charge fills, you can hit him with a juke, like a 360 juke, and a lot of the times it'll make him miss. The reason why this works is because if you're running in a straight line, the Billy will see you doing that, and they won't think that they'll have to look out for a juke. So if you just hit him with it at the last second, it'll a lot of the times work. Keep in mind, this relies on you knowing how long it takes for him to charge his chainsaws, so it does take some learning and some practice. But you can get the base speed down pretty easily. It's 2.5 seconds, but then if the killer has any add-ons, you just have to learn from in the match. You know, if you see him chainsaw at some point in the match, try to, get a general feel for how long it took him, and then do it based off that. Alright, let's talk a little bit about pallet play when it comes to Hillbilly. Now, as you might remember from earlier, I showed you a clip that shows you how the chainsaw will break a pallet that is down if you run into it. Another thing that's important to know, though, is that if someone throws a pallet just as you arrive at it with a chainsaw, as long as they don't time it just perfectly right, you'll break the pallet as they throw it. It's a pretty big deal for time saving, but keep in mind, like I said, if they time it correctly, they can actually get the stun and interrupt your chainsaw. Just to cover this quickly, the way this works is you drop the pallet the second he gets to the actual pallet. If it's a little bit too early, he'll break it. If it's a little bit too late, you'll eat the chainsaw, so you gotta time it just right. But this isn't really too important of a thing to know. There is situations where it can come in handy, but more times than not, you're a lot better off just walking to the side. So that way you could actually save the pallet and loop it and actually use it in the chase as opposed to just trying to get a free stun out of it. There definitely are certain situations though where it comes in really handy. For instance, if you're running to a pallet and the Billy is chainsawing after you and you're about to get to the pallet and you need to throw it to not get chainsawed, the difference between taking the 1 second to get the stun and throwing it too early and getting the insta break can be huge, so it's definitely an important thing to learn how to do. Breaking the pallets with the chainsaws can be really useful though, especially if you're playing against a certain kind of survivor playstyle where they kind of just run up and throw the pallet. We call them pallet campers, where they just run up and throw a pallet and then they just kind of do that, rinse and repeat forever without ever trying to loop it or really punish you. If you see a survivor's doing this, if you kind of catch on to what they're doing, you could just pre-rev your chainsaw every single time they get to a pallet and then instantly break it, and you'll just shred through all the pallets in the map. So it can be really useful. Keep in mind, though, that this strategy is super exploitable from the survivors if they know what they're doing. This is something that should only be done if the survivor you're playing against seems to be rather new to the game or doesn't really understand how to play pallets. But if you play against a survivor that's actually good and understands the game well, they will 100% punish you by just running the loop on you every single time you stop to chainsaw, and then you'll find yourself wasting a lot of time on pallets that you shouldn't. When you're playing against a Billy, you could usually tell when people are doing this, because if you get to a pallet and you throw it and then they just immediately back up and chainsaw it, you can tell that they're the kind of player to try to do it. So if you notice that as a survivor, then you can then take advantage and punish it by faking like you're going to drop the pallet and then just continuing looping. Although, keep in mind, this is super risky, because if you try to fake this and then punish the respect, they have a chance to just come through the pallet anyway, and then that can get you hit and even sometimes chainsawed. Okay, so I was going to leave this out of the video, but I decided last second to put it in. This is a bug that exists for Billy, but I feel like it's important to know about it. If you're charging a chainsaw and then you get stunned while the chainsaw charge is high, you'll lose the amount of charge that you would lose during the stun animation. So a lot of the time, if your charge is high when you get stunned, you'll actually keep a large chunk of the charge and you'll be able to quickly saw the pallet. This can be used in a lot of ways, but I'm pretty sure that it's also a bug and is most likely going to get patched in a future patch, so I don't want to get too in-depth about it because I'm pretty sure this whole section will probably end up being irrelevant. Okay, now on to my favorite part of the whole video, which is the advanced strategies of Billy. This is the kind of stuff that's going to really bridge the gap between good Billies and bad Billies and really make them extremely fun to play as and against. I'm going to be using a lot of clips straight from my live stream for this to make sure that you guys know that these techniques that I'm telling you actually work. Okay, so one of the most basic advanced techniques that you can do is body blocking. Obviously, this is using your body as the Billy because it has its own hitbox that survivors can't pass through. You use it to your advantage to keep the survivors in a place where you want them to be. For instance, if you're just wandering around the map and minding your own business, and then you see a Claudette crouching in a corner, you could actually body block her into that corner and then chainsaw her, and she has no chance to get away or move or dodge it or do anything. It's basically a free down. This kind of thing happens a lot in the lower levels, but as you rank up, you'll start to run into this less and less, but it's still a good thing to keep out for, because if you ever can find it, it's just a free down straight up, which is a huge amount of map pressure. Another really useful way to use body blocking mid-chase is if a survivor messes up and doesn't use a pallet or a window when they should, and you can get in front of it and body block it, you could actually prevent the survivor from using it at all. It's really interesting how this works because the windows and the pallets are pretty big, but surprisingly, the killer doesn't need to take up that much space for the prompt of vaulting to go away. If you notice at the bottom of the screen, it'll have a little prompt where it says hit spacebar to vault, and you can see how far the killer has to be to block it. He doesn't have to be that far in. If he's just even a little bit into the window, it'll completely prevent you from vaulting, and you're just completely helpless. Pallets work the exact same way as well, especially when they're thrown. It basically works the exact same way as a window. But when the pallet's still up, it still can work. You can still body block the pallet. As long as you don't give them enough room, it won't even give them the prompt to throw it. Although if you back up enough and you get directly under the pallet, it will give the prompt to throw down. But as long as you poke out a little bit and just block the survivor from getting under it, they'll never even be able to throw the pallet on you at all. This is something that gets super useful at higher ranks because good survivors will try to bait you into making mistakes by faking window vaults or faking pallet vaults or faking like they're going to throw a pallet and then not doing it. So if you can call them out and then punish it, you can get some free hits that you normally wouldn't be able to get. Another really easy thing you can do as Billy that is actually very effective is chainsaw feathering. So an interesting part about Hillbilly is that if you're charging your chainsaw and then you let off of it and the bar goes completely down, there's no actual cooldown between canceling your ability and being able to act again. Meaning, the second that your chainsaw bar goes the whole way down, you can instantly swing or, vault or kick pallets or do anything that you want to do. So knowing this, as well as knowing what we talked about earlier during the pallet section, you can know that a lot of high-level survivors look to punish Billies that try to chainsaw every pallet, right? Like if you try to just pull out your chainsaw and break the pallet as they throw it over and over again, survivors look to punish that. So if you pull out your chainsaw while coming up to a pallet, they'll assume that you're going to stand there and wait for them to drop it. So if you then just immediately put it away while never stopping your momentum and just bowling through the pallet, they'll not drop the pallet and then you'll be able to catch up to them and get a free hit. If this is something you've never tried to do before, it might sound a little ridiculous, but it is actually crazy how much this works. A good thing to help you here too is knowing how the animation works as killer from the survivor's point of view. This is another reason why I always tell people to play as both sides if you're looking to improve. The way it works is that if the Billy only taps on his chainsaw, he'll kind of just do a little stutter step. Whereas if you kind of tap on your chainsaw like over and over again to keep it at around 5% for like a whole second, it'll actually start the animation of him pulling up his chainsaw, and it'll really sell it and make it look like you're going to be stopping to chainsaw the pallet. So learning to do that just right and just not just tapping your chainsaw but holding it for about a whole second before letting off of it and going through the pallet will really help you out with this. Okay, so for the next thing, we got to refer back to the earlier part of the video where we talk about how high the sensitivity is when you first start chainsawing. We're going to be calling that initial turn sense for the rest of this video. This allows you to curve really far at the beginning of your chainsaws, and it's hard to control, but if you can master it, it opens up so much more potential for mind games and potential plays that you can make with the Billy, and I'm going to do my best to show you how it's done. Okay, so before we really get into it, I want to talk about why this is so strong. Now, as a survivor, if someone's curving, you don't really think they're going to be able to make up the distance that they get on you, on top of the fact that by the time you see that they're curving, they're already going their extra chainsaw speed, so it gives you way less time to react. Not only that, but you actually start your chainsaw a little bit sooner too, so that means that you're moving faster for longer, which gives you a little bit more distance on all these really small loops that you run into on the map. And survivors kind of train themselves to learn just how much distance they need to be safe against the killers, and that little bit of extra distance you make up a lot of the times can really mess with survivors and get you free downs because they'll think they'll be safe. Curving can also help you a lot in certain situations where you can get an M1 hit, but if you go for a back rev, you wouldn't be able to get it in time because they would make it to a pallet or window. If you curve around a corner instead and you get that extra little distance, you can get a one-shot down instead of giving the M1 hit, which allows them to get a speed boost and allows them to continue looping. It cuts the chase time down incredibly. The reason this works so well again too is the same thing as feathering, because survivors are trying to punish killers that chainsaw at pallets too much. So if you chainsaw on your way up to the pallet, they'll continue doing a loop, and then you can just curve around the corner and get a free down when they don't expect it. So I'll do my best to try to teach you how to curve, but a lot of this comes from just experience. It's not really something I could just tell you and have you do it. It takes a ton of practice to get good at it. But First things first, for some reason, the initial turn sense is affected by the controller sensitivity, so even if you're not playing on a controller and you're playing on mouse and keyboard, you need to go into your settings and go to your controller sensitivity. I play with mine at 100%, but you can do whatever you want. 100% allows you to get the most out of your curves. But it also makes it harder to control if you're somebody that isn't that good at it, or if you're someone who's new to Hillbilly and you just can't quite handle the initial turn sense. Having a high controller sensitivity, it might make it harder for you. But if you want to learn curving, I would highly suggest cranking it up. There are a lot of people who rebind Q and E to left and right while chainsawing. So basically, they use it to help them curve. They press Q to go left and they press E to go right while they have their chainsaw out. It's something that I don't really find 100% necessary, but if it helps you and if it's more comfortable for you as far as chainsawing, then I would highly recommend giving it a go. But I use mouse and mouse only, and it works 100% fine for me. Okay, so when you're trying to curve somewhere, say you're trying to curve from the outside of the shack door to the window. You want to start your chainsaw on the way up to the door, and you want the chainsaw to fill right around when you get to the door. That way, with your initial turn sense, you can turn into the shack and then be pointing to the window by the time you get in. This same general rule applies for any like 90-degree walls or pallets that you're trying to curve around as well. You basically just charge your chainsaw on the way up to it, and then right before you get to the corner, you let go of it. If you're not exactly at the corner, you can wait like about a half a second before you start turning right to make sure you don't bump into the wall, and then you just curve around, straighten yourself out, and then go, whichever way you're trying to go. It's also important to know what we said earlier about being able to slide off walls as long as you're not facing them too much, because if you curve a little bit too much, it's okay, because as long as you straighten yourself out, you shouldn't collide into the wall, and you should be able to keep going around the curve. A big mistake you'll probably find yourself doing a lot, and even I find myself doing it a lot, is turning a little bit too quickly, especially if you're trying to curve around a corner. It's very touchy, and you got to make sure you get it just right, and sometimes it's good to be a little bit further away from the corner as well, which can help a lot too. But if you practice enough, and as long as you're very patient in the midst of a chase, you'll be able to get the curve pretty much every time with practice. It's also really important to know your surroundings when curving and knowing like the shapes of the tiles that you're on, because a lot of tiles will have things poking out that if you don't really understand the shape of the tile well, you could run into them. So you got to make sure to do your best to memorize what things are on maps and know when you have to take the curve kind of wide or take the curve kind of tight, and that kind of just comes with practice. Unfortunately, there's no like magical advice I can give you that can make you good at controlling the initial turn sensitivity. It's just kind of something you have to trial and error. And if it's something that you're going to learn, you're going to have a long period of time where you're not good at it and you're going to look like a dumbass quite a bit in your games. But I would highly suggest taking the time to learn it, because it will open up so much more potential out of your Billy play, and it'll really allow you to push your play to that next level. Keep in mind that both of the engravings add-ons are incredibly strong when it comes to curving. We're going to get into the add-ons more later, but I just feel the need to say that the engravings, if you're looking just for curving, is such an important thing. I would not suggest running both of them at the same time, especially if you're newer. It's extremely hard to deal with the really high charge time, but even running just one, if not both, can make a big difference in the amount of distance that you make up because of the extra movement speed you get while running. Zoning is another huge part of Hillbilly and another thing that makes him so good. Now, pallet zoning is something that you should be doing as every killer, which is basically ensuring the position of where the survivor is as the pallet gets broken. But you can do it even better with Hillbilly because the pallet gets broken instantly whenever you chainsaw it, as well as you being able to charge the chainsaw while moving. So I've already done a video that has explanations to pallet zoning in it, but I'll still cover it really briefly. Basically, what it is after a pallet's thrown, you can kind of control the position of the survivor because they'll always loop away from the direction that you go. So you basically force them into the position that is the furthest away from any nearby windows or pallets, and then you break the pallet. So that way, after the pallet's broken, they have a further way to get to safety, and you can take advantage and hopefully get a hit. On top of pallet zoning, though, there's also another kind of zoning you can do with Billy, where you kind of just hold out your chainsaw whenever a survivor is about to get to a window or pallet, and you basically scare them into not taking the window or pallet, or if it looks like they're going to do it anyway, you can just chainsaw to that window or pallet and then body block it to keep them from doing it. This can be a really big deal if you're on one of the maps that has an extremely strong window that you want the survivors to stay away from. You can also use chainsaw zoning as a way to kind of force survivors into a bad position. If they're heading towards a pallet, you can pull out the chainsaw to scare them into, not taking the pallet because they'll get chainsawed if they run in a straight line. So you can force them off to a side where they're not so safe, and then you can just put away your chainsaw to either get a free M1 hit or even a chainsaw if you have enough distance on them. This can also be a really powerful tool if you're going against good survivors that try to be greedy and conserve pallets, especially at really strong tiles like Shack. You can pull out your chainsaw on the way up to the pallet, and sometimes they won't drop it and they'll run in. And once you get here, you're in the position of power because your chainsaw is already revved to around 90%. So they can either try to vault the window, in which case you could just fill the chainsaw and chainsaw them during the vault animation. They can try to fake the window vault, which is most likely what they will usually do, in which case you could just wait for them to fake it and then chainsaw them on the other side. So pretty much no matter what they do, once you zone them to this position, you're basically in control, and as long as you don't misplay it, you'll get an insta down every single time. Another sort of mind game you can do is, I guess I'll just call it fake pallet breaking, where you kind of rev your chainsaw up to a pallet, and because the survivor thinks that you're just going to chainsaw the pallet, they immediately start leaving the tile to try to find the next pallet. But what you actually do is you just don't chainsaw the pallet, and you instead just head towards them in their direction, and then they get caught in a bad position, and then you get a free hit. This might be something that seems a bit obvious or a little silly because of how easy it would be to counterplay, but you'd be surprised how many Survivor players play against Hillbillies often that will just constantly immediately chainsaw pallets the second they're thrown. This is something that you can test very quickly by just pulling out your chainsaw and seeing what the Survivor does, and if they happen to overcommit a little bit too much to going into the next tile, then you can just immediately take advantage of it. But if they're well aware and they don't leave the tile until you actually break the pallet, then you can just instantly give up on this mind game for the rest of the match on that particular Survivor. So essentially, all these advanced techniques that I just taught you are literally the thing that makes Billies such a crazy, dangerous, and fun killer. If you take the time to get good at these mind games and techniques that I teach you, you can start using them together in tandem, and then your whole chase becomes a huge mind game. And if a survivor even so much as makes a tiny mistake, you can take advantage of it by getting a chainsaw hit. The ability to bait out mistakes and also the ability to punish mistakes by an actual one-shot down is what really makes Billy stand out from the rest of the killer cast. Keep in mind that these strategies are heavily based off the survivor's playstyles. You should always, as any killer, base your strategy off the survivor that you're playing against and take advantage of the mistakes that they make. For instance, things like chainsaw feathering at pallets will not work against survivors that just kind of throw pallets every opportunity they get and don't ever try to punish pallet respect. But if a survivor is actively trying to punish pallet respect and you can tell that they're a greedy survivor, you can take advantage using these kind of mind games. So you have to know what to do and what not to do based off the survivor that you're playing against. But it's very important to try to get chainsaws at any opportunity because the ability to one-shot down and not prolong the chase into 2 different M1 hits is a huge deal. So as far as playing against these advanced techniques as Survivor, it all boils down to, again, the most important thing in Dead by Daylight, which is being able to identify the playstyle of the person you're playing against. Most Billies aren't going to be doing this super advanced stuff, so you really won't have to worry about it a lot of the time, but if you do run into a killer who is very obviously very skilled at Hillbilly, if they're doing things like chainsaw curving, if they're faking pallet breaks and then, using it to bait you into a bad position or anything similar, then you really have to be on the lookout for all these mind games I just mentioned you. Chainsaw feathering is something that's pretty easy to counterplay by just simply throwing the pallet. Now again, I know that if a Billy player plays badly and, respects pallets with chainsaws, you should be continuing looping, but you should never assume that right off the bat. I've seen a lot of Survivor players make the mistake of falling for a feather with the first pallet play that they get against the killer. You definitely want to test the killer and see what their playstyle is before trying to punish any mistakes. So it's pretty safe to say that you can just play it kind of safe and just throw pallets until you figure out how the killer plays, and then once you figure out what they do, then you can take advantage. Curves are something that's more difficult to avoid, but you can do it. A lot of curve Billies will rely on you to bowl through a pallet and kind of trying to punish the chainsaw, so obviously just throwing pallets and getting stuns will stop that a lot of the time. But if you do find yourself in a position where it seems like you're about to get curve sawed on, you can kind of jet out to the side and not hug the wall, which a lot of the times will save your life. And a big one that you can avoid as well pretty easily is the faking chainsaws on down pallets to get you into a missed position. Again, if you're playing against a really good skilled Hillbilly, don't be greedy and don't be trying to work your way to the next pallet before the pallet even gets broken. If you're at a pallet that's downed and it's a safe pallet, if you don't know what safe pallets are, it's a pallet where they can't reasonably get a hit on you, right? If you're at a safe pallet against a Hillbilly, you don't want to leave that pallet to go to the next tile until it's broken. So even if he's sitting there chainsawing at it, just wait until he actually starts to chainsaw and break the pallet before you go to the next tile. It's definitely worth the wait so you don't get caught out in a bad position. Okay, so now that we covered everything there is to know about playing Hillbilly and playing against Hillbilly at his very basic core, let's talk a little bit about add-ons. Billy has a pretty wide selection of add-ons and some that are very unique, but a lot of them can be kind of categorized into the same category with their strength increasing as their rarity increases. For example, charge time add-ons are some of the strongest add-ons you can run on Billy, and they kind of just scale up with rarity. There's the Spark Plug, which is the gray rarity, the Primer Ball, which is the yellow rarity, and then there's a Carburetor Tuning Guide, which is the green rarity, although it does a lot more than just charge time. So the reason why this is so strong is not only the fact that it affects charge speed, which is one of the more important stats on Billy, but also because the numbers that they tie to these are actually pretty intense. For instance, the common Spark Plug is a 12% reduction in your charge speed, and the Primer Bomb and the Tuning Guide are an 18%. These numbers are pretty beefy and they affect the chainsaw quite a bit. This can throw off survivors a lot because if you're running charge time add-ons, they can't really judge when you're going to start your chainsaw. So certain vaults and pallets that you would normally make against the Hillbilly if he had default charge speed, you wouldn't make against him if he has faster charge speed. This really opens you up to get chainsaws on a lot of tiles that you normally wouldn't have the room to get. On top of that, it also really messes with people as far as juking chainsaws. If you refer to what I said earlier in the survivor section about juking chainsaws, where you have to guess the charge speed and then juke accordingly, if it's a very, very fast charge time, it's really hard for a survivor to predict that and then really juke. So a lot of the times you could just straight up full charge back rev someone and they won't even see it coming. The next one's up, and in my opinion, the second strongest group of add-ons are the cooldown add-ons. Now, these ones kind of are the same way as the charge time, where there's different rarities, and each rarity affects it a little bit more, but these ones affect the actual cooldown after you either A, land a chainsaw, or B, let go of the chainsaw while just running. It will not affect bumping into objects, however, as that's a whole separate add-on. So the common add-on for cooldown is the vegetable oil, and it lowers the cooldown by 16%, which is a pretty decent amount. The shop lube is the yellow, and it lowers it by 22%, and the green is the Thompson mix, which lowers it by 28%, as well as actually having the same effect as Spark Plug too, which is a 12% reduction in charge time. These add-ons are pretty strong because they give you extra time at important times. Like, for instance, if you chainsaw up to a generator while someone's working on it, the cooldown is significantly less, which makes you able to catch up to the survivor as they run away much, much faster. It can sometimes be the difference between them making it to a pallet or a window and you just getting the down rate away. It's also extremely strong for when you actually land the chainsaw, especially if you're going for like a slugging, snowballing, map pressure type of gameplay, which is usually what you do as Hillbilly, because you can down somebody, then immediately act and start looking for other people to chase and down. Here's a side-by-side of no cooldown add-ons versus two of the best cooldown add-ons, so you can see the amount of difference that it actually makes. Okay, so the next add-ons we're going to cover are the bump add-ons. These ones reduce the fatigue when you bump into an object with your chainsaw, and the numbers on these are actually really high, but there's also not a lot of situations where these really come in useful. There's only two add-ons for this, and there's the depth gauge rake, which reduces it by 20%, and then the light chassis, which reduces it by 28%. When stacked, this gives you a really, really fast cooldown after bumping into objects, and you can act and swing pretty quickly after bumping. The issue with this, though, is that there's not really a lot of situations in game where you're going to be able to bump into a wall and then immediately hit a survivor, because usually you're going to have to run past a survivor a short distance to actually reach the wall. So while these add-ons are pretty fun, there's not really a lot of practical use for these, but you can still throw them on if you just want to have some fun. Okay, so one of the most fun set of add-ons are the turning add-ons. These ones make it so that your actual turning while in the middle of your chainsaw is significantly better. So there are two add-ons that affect this, and that's the Spiked Boots and Thompson's Moonshine. I wasn't actually able to get numbers for this through testing myself, so I'm going to have to just trust the Wikipedia that says that the Spiked Boots increase it by 28%, and the Moonshine increases it by 44%. That's just the amount of steering that you can do while chainsawing. Keep in mind that this effect only works after the initial turn sense, so it will not help your curves at all. It'll only kick in after the initial 1 second of initial turn sense, and also the controller sensitivity does not affect this either. No matter what your controller sensitivity is set to, you will still turn the same speed. It's pretty important to note that the Thompson Moonshine also has a significant penalty to running into walls if you run it as well. So if you end up running into a wall while running Moonshine, you'll suffer a pretty big penalty. So these add-ons obviously are going to help you get around the map easier because you won't be bumping into objects as much. But I think it's kind of important to note that if you're a skilled Hillbilly player and you practice a lot, you can kind of navigate the map just fine without these add-ons. So they're not really extremely practical, as you don't get much benefit from running them that you don't get without running them. But they're definitely fun, and they definitely can be strong in some other areas too. For instance, if you're trying to go for a chainsaw that isn't a back rev, you can use your turning to your advantage to kind of mind game the survivor into coming back into your chainsaw. It also can help you a lot too in situations where survivors turn corners that they don't think you'll be able to turn, but then you actually do curve them because you have such insane turning. The main power behind these add-ons is the element of surprise of them not knowing you have it, and then hitting them with like an unexpected curve that they don't think that you should be able to do. Once they kind of realize what you have, and if they try to play around it, it becomes significantly easier for them. But again, these are really fun add-ons, and they can still give you a lot of benefit if you know what you're doing with them. Okay, the next group of add-ons are ones that are probably my personal favorite, and they're the engravings / speed add-ons. These ones make it so that when you're actually in your chainsaw sprint, you go faster. So the yellow engravings are the death engravings, and they add an extra 15% to your movement speed, but they also add an extra 12% to your charge time, so they have a pretty significant drawback. The doom engravings are the same way, but they add 20%, but they still add the same 12% to charge time. Keep in mind that you don't really need to run both add-ons, as one add-on, either one, adds a significant amount of speed, and stacking them both is a little unnecessary, as it also makes your charge time ridiculously high. The extra charge time you get from stacking both of them will screw you over in a lot of situations because it adds almost a full extra second to the charge time. So there's a lot of situations where you might normally be able to get a chainsaw, but instead they'll make it to the pallet or window easily because of how long your charge time is. Because of this, it's almost always better to run these add-ons with some time of charge time add-on as well to counteract the downside. These add-ons really shine though if you're going to be curving as Billy. The reason why this works so well is because you get from where you start chainsawing to where the survivor is significantly faster, and that gives them even less time to turn a corner or get somewhere where they're safe. Again, if you stack double engravings, it makes it very hard because the charge time is significantly higher and you really got to extra compensate for it. It'll take some practice. But if you combine it with some charge time add-ons like Tuning Guide or Primer Bulb or something, it'll make the charge time actually shorter than default and you'll move faster, and it makes it very powerful for curving. Outside of curving, though, these add-ons aren't really extremely useful. There is some things you can do outside of curving, but they might affect your ability to just get around the map because you're moving significantly faster, which means it's harder to go from side to side and avoid bumping into objects. So this is something that I think is strictly for curve Billies if you're interested in curving and trying to get good curves. If you're not going for curves, I would probably run something else. Okay, so for the silent add-ons, there's really no good way for me to do this, so I'm just going to tell you right now that the chainsaw file, which is the common, reduces the sound by 30, and the muffler reduces the sound by 35%. So the only way I can really think to show you this is just to show you a clip of the Billy going past me without any add-ons and then with both add-ons stacked. So here you go. So as you can tell, it doesn't really affect the sound of the chainsaw from far away. It sounds about the same, but whenever the Billy is actually close to you, it kind of makes the chainsaw sound like it's still far away. So these add-ons can be used to kind of mess with the survivor's hearing, and you can play some interesting mind games with it, but it's really not that powerful. If a survivor has their eye on you, it's not going to matter how much sound your chainsaw is making, so they're not extremely powerful add-ons, but you can mess around with them and have some fun if you want to try. Another add-on that we can quickly cover is a fun one called Speed Limiter that makes your chainsaw do one state of damage instead of two, while also giving you extra blood points. Now, this is obviously a direct nerf to the killer's ability, and it makes you significantly weaker as a trade-off for extra blood points. As you can see, if you land the chainsaw, you get 1275 deviousness as opposed to the 750 that you normally get. This is something that's only strictly used for fun and extra blood point gain, and obviously if you're trying to just kill people and do well, this is not an add-on that you want to run. I do feel the need to throw in there that this is actually affected by the exposed status, so if you're running something like No-Ed or Make Your Choice and the survivor is exposed, you actually will get the one-shot down even with speed limiters, so it's a pretty interesting interaction. Okay, so for the last add-ons, I don't think I really needed to give you guys video or clips to kind of complement them. They're kind of pretty easy to explain. For instance, we're going to be talking about the chains. There's the Grizzly chain, the Rusted chain, and the Begrimed chain as they go up in rarity. The Grizzly chain makes it so that anybody hit by the chainsaw for the next 90 seconds, they repair generators 9% slower, so it just takes them slightly longer to do generators. Each of the chains lasts 90 seconds, even though only the Grizzly chain says it in its description. Moving right along to the Rusted chain, it makes you mangled for 90 seconds, which is, if you guys don't know, the status effect that makes it take longer for you to heal or for someone to heal you. And then if we go to the Begrimed chain, that is the combination of the two. It makes you both mangled and makes the generators go slower. For some reason, the Begrimed chain stacks with the yellow chain for double generator slowdown, but it doesn't stack with the mangled. Like, stacking Begrimed and Rusted will not double the mangle. It's still the same mangled, but the generator ones do stack. So if you, it says does not stack, but they actually do. I'm not sure if it's a bug. It might be a bug and it could get fixed in the future, so I can't say for sure. But as of right now, the Begrimed chain and the Grizzly chain do stack and make the generator progress slower. But again, it's really not that useful because it's only 90 seconds after the chainsaw, and a lot of the times after you chainsaw someone, you're going to be hooking them or they're going to be slugged. They probably won't be doing gens for most of that 90 seconds, so it's really not that powerful. But they're definitely interesting add-ons that you can run if you just feel like applying some afflictions to the survivors that you're playing against. The Begrimed and the Rusted chain that apply mangled can actually be pretty useful as well if you plan on slugging and leaving people on the ground, because they have to be healed to be picked up, which makes that go slower because of the mangled status effect. But aside from that, I would not really recommend these chains. There's definitely better add-ons to run. And then the very last add-on that we can cover is the long guide bar, which all it says is that it slightly increases the reach of the chainsaw. This one's weird because it is extremely not noticeable. I have tried testing this and messing around with it, and there's like a very slight difference that you can see if you, like, you know, line up at a window and see the real range, but it's barely noticeable at all. And in like 99.9% of situations, the extra length that this add-on gives you is not going to make any difference, and it's not really that powerful of an add-on. I really wouldn't bother playing around with this too much. There are a lot of people that give this add-on credit for getting chainsaws through windows, but I am almost 100% positive that that all comes down to lag comp and other issues that aren't long guide bar, because I've gotten plenty even without long guide bar, and it's happened to me with or without, so I'm pretty sure this add-on is just pretty much useless, and I wouldn't really bother with it. Okay, quick note that while I was editing this, I realized that I didn't talk about Carburetor Tuning Guide, which is a really interesting add-on because it's literally just a bunch of other add-ons put into one. This moderately decreases the chainsaw charge time, it slightly decreases the cooldown, slightly reduces the penalty when bumping into objects, and slightly reduces the noise. So this add-on is quite literally a primer bulb, a vegetable oil, a slightly weaker depth gauge rake, and a chainsaw file all put into one singular add-on. This makes it probably the strongest overall add-on for Hillbilly. Okay, so as far as perks for Billy goes, I want to cover this a little bit and talk about what's good and bad on them, but I'm not going to cover every single killer perk because there's like 50 of them and that would take forever. So I'll give you guys a quick list of perks that are great for Billy, perks that are good for Billy, perks that are kind of okay for Billy, and then perks that seem like they might be okay but are actually bad to run. I'll call them like bait perks, and I'll talk a little bit about them. So among the best perks to run are Whispers, Nurse's Calling, and then the Enduring Spirit Fury combo, although just running Enduring alone is amazing as well. Combining it with Spirit Fury just makes it insane. Whispers is amazing. If you don't know how to use Whispers, I actually have a guide specifically for that perk, and I can link it in the video, and you guys can check that out if you don't know how to use it. It is by far the best killer perk overall in the game, and it's even better on Billy because it really helps you find people to keep up your pressure. Nurse's Calling is another amazing perk that gives you a lot of information, as well as the fact that it helps you with slugging, which is going to be a really, really important thing with Billy when we get into like the strategies. It really helps you keep track of your slugs, and it also just gives you information about where survivors are and helps you snowball really, really fast. Enduring plus Spirit Fury combo gives you a free hit. I personally find this combo to be ridiculous. I don't run it, because I find it to be too strong, and I honestly don't even think it's fair for the survivors. But you can run the 2, and then whenever you break enough pallets, the next pallet that you get stunned by will just break on their face, and then you could potentially get a one-shot down afterwards with your chainsaw. So it can be pretty insane on Billy. It can do a lot in chases. But even without the combo, just running Enduring is really good because it means that you can just swing through pallets and basically just disregard pallets' existences. You don't even have to care about being stunned. You can just swing through pallets, walk through pallets, do whatever you want, because even if you get stunned, the stun lasts less than a second. So pallets just basically don't exist for you if you run Enduring. So it's very, very strong. On to the pretty good tier, which are the perks that are good but not the best, but still strong. And I put barbecue and chili in this tier reluctantly. I love this perk. It gives you a lot of information about where people are across the map, and it also gives you double blood points, which is also amazing. I personally run it every match, but with the addition of lockers blocking auras, it's slightly less useful these days. A lot of the times you'll hook people and see no auras and get no value out of it. So even though I was almost going to put it in God tier, I put it into the pretty good tier. And I mean, I think you should run this just for the extra blood points, probably. Moving on to Hex Ruin. Hex Ruin is a obviously staple perk in almost every killer build ever. Billy, however, is one of the only killers that I think can do good without it. And the thing about Ruin is, even though it's so extremely powerful and it's so good for slowing down the game, and it helps a lot if you're a killer that can't really apply the pressure on your own, it's also inconsistent. So if it gets broken in the first 5 seconds, you're down a perk, right? Which, of course, that won't happen all the time, but Billy is one of the rare killers where you can just run other aggressive perks, such as Enduring, Spirit Fury, Nurse's Calling. You know, you can run these very aggressive perks that help you just play fast and aggressively. Then you won't need the inconsistency of Hex Ruin. You'll be able to win games more consistently by just applying map pressure, as opposed to relying on Hex Ruin not getting broken in the first 5 seconds. If you do want a game slowdown perk, though, and you don't want to use something unreliable like Ruin, even though Ruin is strong, you could run it. Pop Goes the Weasel is a great alternative. Billy is very, very mobile, so after you hook somebody, it's not very hard to just chainsaw to a generator that you know is worked on, kick it, and then chainsaw towards where a survivor might be. So Pop Goes is actually a very strong perk on Billy if you do want a game slowdown. And Discordance is a good alternative to Whispers if you want a alternative tracking perk. If you're just not confident in your Whispers abilities, or if you just aren't a fan of Whispers, Discordance is a great perk to find multiple survivors grouped up. Because you'll find that whenever we get into the strategy section, that grouped up survivors are very, very, very useful for Billy. So Discordance is actually a pretty strong tracking perk. Okay, on to the next tier, which is the you're not crazy if you run this, but it's also not one of the best perks tier. And to start out, we have Agitation. Agitation is interesting because it has a lot of utility. It can help you get to hooks in situations where you might not normally get to a hook. It also just kind of gets you to the hook faster so that you can get back out downing survivors faster. It saves you a little bit of time, which is always nice in any perk. But I don't think it's that necessary. With the current meta of DBD, there's not really a lot of like sabotaging going on. It's very rare. There's very few times that you struggle to get someone to a hook. And even if people are body blocking, it's really not that big of a deal to trade hits for a hook state. So I wouldn't suggest running this, although if you do run it, you're not crazy. Bitter Murmur is an alternative to a tracking perk, although I would not run it over Discordance or Whispers. Bitter Murmur makes it so you can see auras of people after they finish the generators, which does help you find people, but usually it helps you find people in a spot where there's not really important to pressure them. If you're chasing people after they finish a generator, you're probably better off finding people that are actively on a generator, so I wouldn't suggest it, but it is an option, it is available, you wouldn't be too crazy to run it. And next we have Devour Hope. Devour Hope's an interesting perk because I usually don't recommend running anything that has Exposed on Billy because of his one-shot down, but Devour Hope is just a straight-up fun perk. Like, I can't really tell you not to run a perk that's as fun as Devour Hope, especially on a killer like Billy, who is really good at making up distance and being mobile, so he's going to be able to get away from the hook in time and come back to the hook in time, and you could really get stacks quickly, and especially if you're putting a lot of pressure on the map, they won't really have time to even look for your totem, so this is actually a pretty okay perk on Billy. And the last one in this tier is Thanatophobia. Thanatophobia is not the strongest perk. Even if you have 2, 3, 4 people injured, the effects that it gives is not that big of a deal. It doesn't slow the game down that much, but as Hillbilly, if you're snowballing and you have multiple people slugged and you're starting to build up a snowball of map pressure, Thanatophobia can kind of pile on top of that map pressure for even more. It's really not that necessary, because if you're on that stage of the game, you probably are already going to win anyway, so you don't need the extra oomph from Thanatophobia, but it definitely couldn't hurt. It also gives people the incentive to heal, which is good against Hillbilly because you have a one-shot down. So if they're wasting their time healing, and if you're a skilled Hillbilly who is good at landing chainsaws, that's basically dead time they're spending healing, because you're going to hopefully one-shot down them whenever you see them. Okay, and on to the final category, which are the bait perks. This one's interesting because some people might get a little bit iffy with me on these, but to start out, Bamboozle is not a good perk. I'm just gonna, on any killer, I don't think Bamboozle is a good perk. I think it's only good for blocking the super long time waster / infinite windows / whatever you want to call them. I think that's all Bamboozle is good for. Most windows in the maps, like on the general tiles around the map, are the ones that have the most counterplay, and that's where you can land your chainsaws. Like windows like on T-walls or Longwall Jungle Gyms or even on Shack, if you mind game them correctly as Billy, you can straight up get chainsaw hits on those windows. If you're using Bamboozle and you're blocking every single window and forcing the survivors to go to pallets, it becomes way harder to get your chainsaws. I would not recommend wasting a perk slot on this. Moving right along, we got Deerstalker and Knockout. These are both perks that you might think are good because of how strong slugging is on Hillbilly, but Deerstalker is actually not that good because it doesn't really show when the people are being healed. Nurse's Calling is basically just better in every way because Deerstalker can make it so you don't lose track of the people that you have downed, but if you just have generally good game sense and you can listen well to like their screams of pain, you can kind of keep track of them on your own. You don't really need Deerstalker. It kind of just comes with practice. And it also doesn't give you any information as far as when they're being picked up, whereas Nurse's Calling does. So Nurse's Calling is just superior in every way. Deerstalker might seem like a good idea, but I promise you it's a waste of a perk slot. Knockout's the same way, where it seems like if you're leaving people on the ground a lot, Knockout would be good. But it's actually kind of bad because you want survivors to see the auras of the people that are down because you want to bait them into being altruistic. Billy does the best when people are being overly altruistic and all gathering up as a group and saving each other. Because that's when you can snowball hits. That's when you can get multiple chainsaws back to back and down everyone. So if people aren't seeing the auras of the people that are downed and they're not coming to heal them, that means that they're going to stay on generators, which is actually the ideal play against Billies. So you're actually kind of forcing them to play against you the best way possible. Whereas without Knockout, you kind of bait them into making mistakes by being overly altruistic. Make Your Choice is a weird one. This one, I was almost thinking of not putting in bait perks, but I still think I want to put it here. It's an exposed perk. Billy is highly mobile, so you might think that like leaving the hook and then immediately chainsawing back as soon as someone gets unhooked might be good. And it even can be kind of strong, but again, it causes exposed, and if you're a good Hillbilly player, which you should aspire to be, you should aspire to be a good Billy. You should never be satisfied with being mediocre. If you're pushing to be a good Hillbilly player, you don't need the exposed status from Make Your Choice. You can instead save that perk slot for something much stronger that can help you snowball map pressure, and you can just land chainsaws instead of relying on M1ing your Make Your Choice target. And last but not least, we got the crowd favorite Noed, which, again, I'm not going to knock on this perk too much, but as Billy, it's not that necessary. It gives you exposed. It can also be cleansed before the end of the match, or it can be cleansed the second it gets active in the end game. It's really not that useful because Billy already has a one-shot down. He doesn't really need the one-shot downs from Noed. So even though Noed is a perk that can turn a losing game into a winning game, on Billy, it's just not really necessary. You can definitely find other perks that will help you throughout the whole match as opposed to only at the very end. Obviously, there's a lot of perks that aren't even mentioned on this short list as well that you could interchange in and out, but these are the main perks that I think are good to run and the main ones that you might feel like are good to run but are actually not good. There's definitely some other like hex perks or some other things that you could switch in and out, and it's all preference, but these are the general core perks that I feel like most Billy players tend to run. Okay, so let's get into strategy as Hillbilly. When you first spawn into a map, you're going to obviously be nowhere near the survivors. If you're running whispers, it'll help you a lot. You can immediately spawn in, start chainsawing in the direction of a faraway generator to see if whispers clicks on. If it doesn't click on, you can kind of just keep rotating around the map and wait until you find an area where whispers does click on. Now, if you know how to use whispers, you'll realize that when it clicks on, there will be someone 32 meters away from you. So you can find the generator that's around 32 meters away and check that for the survivors, and you'll almost always find somebody. If you don't have whispers, then you're kind of just on your own, and you kind of just need to patrol generators. That's when the game's on, and that's when you start getting the map pressure. So you start trying to catch them. Obviously, you can use all the mind games, all the tricks that I showed you in the match. You can use any just general killer knowledge you have. I know I cover very Billy specific things, but if you play killer in general, you probably know some general mind games to do to try to get downs. So you can use everything that I taught you and everything that you probably have learned yourself to get downs as fast as possible. And if you're a good hillbilly, it shouldn't hopefully take too long, because again, you have a one-shot down and you have a ton of mind games at your disposal, so you should be able to get it. And keep in mind, this is what's important about Billy. He's a fast-paced killer. So the key with him is to constantly have map pressure. You can't be having chases last too long. You can't be, messing around too much. It's really important to get your downs quick and get the map pressure out there to get people off of generators. Now, generally, the best thing to do as Billy is to snowball map pressure. And what I mean by this is when you have a guy on a hook, that's map pressure, right? Someone has to get off generators to come unhook him, okay? So if you down another person and leave them on the ground, which is what I call slugging, that also adds the same amount of pressure as someone being hooked. Someone needs to get off to heal that person. That's the person on the ground, the person on the hook, both aren't doing gens, and the teammates need to come help them. So what you can do is you can leave multiple people on the hook and on the ground, and if you don't waste the time it takes to carry a down guy to a hook, you can use that time, even though it's only like 8 or 10 seconds. 8 or 10 seconds is a significant amount of time. You could use that time to instead go find other teammates and down them and keep them down. This is why I was talking earlier about Nurse's Calling being so important and all these fast-paced perks being important, because if you're a good hillbilly player and you can start snowballing map pressure, all the pieces start falling together and you can kind of just keep everyone down, you can keep everyone pressured, and they won't really be able to do much of anything. As long as you don't waste any time, as long as you're very smart about time efficiency, you're slugging, you're snowballing the pressure, they won't be able to do anything and the survivors will get easily overwhelmed. Keep in mind that not every game goes as smoothly as this game that's playing in the background right now. This was a very, very good game where the survivors happened to group up and play really altruistically, and I got to take advantage as Billy. Not every game will go this way. A lot of games, the survivors will split up and do generators, and you won't really have the chance to snowball map pressure. And that's kind of the one weakness of Billy, is that he's very reliant on survivor mistakes. Now, keep in mind, you make an even slight mistake, and Billy can take a huge advantage and basically win the whole game. But, hypothetically, if the survivors don't make any mistakes, they split up and do generators, and, as long as they're good in chases and don't get down super quickly, then it's very, very, very hard, borderline impossible to win as Billy. But that rarely happens. There are almost always mistakes coming out of survivors, and the overly altruistic mistake is one of the most common ones, and eventually it'll happen. I've had games where I get barely any hooks and all five gens get done, and then right at the very end people get overly altruistic, and then I could 4-man down everyone and then get 4 kills right at the very end. So the idea behind Billy is just to play your best, apply as much map pressure as you can, and make sure that you're looking out for opportunities to snowball map pressure, because that's how you win the game as Billy. If you're just constantly downing someone, hooking them, chasing after someone else, downing them, hooking them, if that's all you're doing and you're not trying to snowball your map pressure, you will not be able to win, especially at higher ranks. People are going to get the gens done, and it's going to be really, really hard to accomplish much of anything. You'll probably be ending games with around 1 or 2 kills, even if you play phenomenally. So this is the general idea behind Billy. Keep in mind as well, it's really important to know when to slug and when not to slug. I also have a video about this too. I know this is probably sounding really old, me saying this over and over again, but I have a video on map pressure that kind of covers this as well. But to briefly cover it, basically, don't go out of your way to slug. It's not beneficial to slug just randomly. You only want to slug somebody when there is another survivor nearby that looks like you'll be able to down quickly, right? If you down someone and then you hear someone near you, or you see someone near you that you can chase immediately, then it's worth it to down the person and then go find them. But if you down someone and there's no sign of any survivors anywhere near you, if you leave that person on the ground and go looking around, everyone might be on generators across the map, and then you're just wasting time that you could be hooking. So keep that in mind. I don't want this to encourage people just to go out of their way to slug everyone all the time. There's definitely a time and place, and that's kind of a learning curve that comes with Billy, is knowing when to slug, when not to slug, when to chase. Also, a really important thing to know is when not to chase survivors. That's a very important thing as well. This clip doesn't show it, but there's a lot of situations where you'll load into a map and you'll be in a very strong area with a lot of pallets, and you're playing against a survivor who is very clearly good at the game and very skilled, and you can basically just know that you're not going to be able to catch them quickly no matter how good you play. I have these situations all the time, and a lot of the times you have to just bail from the chase and go find a, you know, survivor that's going to be in either a weaker area or a survivor that maybe isn't quite as skilled that you'll be able to down quickly. And you just got to make sure that you have map pressure. If there's a chase that isn't going to be efficient for you, then you need to leave that chase, and with your high mobility, you could easily go find other survivors. It's good to know that Billy actually is kind of anti-stealth already, because his ability makes him so mobile that if you're a survivor who's trying to hide, say if you're working on a generator and you're looking to hide if a killer comes nearby, by the time you hear the heartbeat, if the killer is chainsawing the whole way to your generator, you won't even have time to hide by the time he gets there. So definitely don't be shy about bailing on a bad situation, because like I said, as Hillbilly, it's all about time and time efficiency and applying map pressure as fast as you can. If you're in a situation where you can't quickly apply pressure, you need to put yourself in a position where you can. Alright guys, I think that's finally it for the Billy video. This video ended up being way longer than I anticipated, but I hope you guys can take something from this. It's important to keep in mind that Billy is one of the highest skill ceiling killers in this game. I think only second to maybe Huntress. So there's going to be a lot of mistakes made if you're trying to learn him. You're going to have a lot of bad games. Hell, even the best Billy players in the game have really bad games. They make a lot of mistakes, you know, but if you're taking the time to practice the things that I showed you in this video, and if you're really taking the time to learn all these advanced things there is about Billy, you're going to find yourself most likely having a ton of fun, as well as completely demolishing games a lot of the time. So thank you guys for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to subscribe to the channel for similar content, and like it or whatever. Share with your friends and family. I don't know, whatever YouTubers are supposed to say at the end of their videos. I'm not even sure. And that's it. I'm out of here. Have a good rest of your day/night, and see you guys later. I'm out of here. See you later. See ya. I'm out of here. See ya.